welcome to this meeting, which is basically at the crack of dawn for everybody who is used to going to these kinds of meetings around this town. But we are very fortunate with us to have Michael Adler, who is currently a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center and really an expert on the diplomacy in the Iranian nuclear crisis. I've known Michael for a number of years, and I think he has been present at every meeting between the Iranians and the P5+1, which have not been many, but he has been in Vienna when the Iranian nuclear issue was discussed, and we couldn't get a better person to tell us what happened in Istanbul 2 weeks ago. But not only that, I mean, I got an email from him from Istanbul. He said, I'm going to Israel from Istanbul, and I assume that he probably wanted to get the reaction of the Israelis to, do we call it a breakthrough, or do we call it the beginning of an understanding between Iran and the P5+1? We shall wait and see. I think I'm slightly more optimistic than Michael about the future. So we will, Michael will speak for half an hour, and then we'll open the floor for a very sort of serious discussion and get your views on what he says. Michael.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. And I went to Israel because when you're in Istanbul, it feels like it's next door, even though it's not, because it's a longer flight from here. So I just decided I would pop over. It's not that I'm not optimistic, but this has been a long process with a lot of progress and a lot of setbacks. And I thought I would start by reviewing a little bit what was the situation before Istanbul, how the meeting took shape at the end, and then why things would look hopeful after that meeting. I think before Istanbul, certainly before March, there was an unprecedented feeling that it was a movement. It almost felt like a rush to war. And I want to just briefly go through a timeline to see just how bad things looked before Obama met with Netanyahu on March 5th in Washington. We had in September, this is a crisis that started in 2002 when two previously secret sites were revealed in Iran, one that was an uranium enrichment site, the other that was a heavy water reactor, both sites being built. But these were basically the two ways, one to make uranium, one that could make plutonium, the two ways that you could get towards a nuclear weapon. And then an investigation by the IAEA began, the International Atomic Energy Agency began in 2003, and there's been a lot of diplomatic action. So I want to fast forward to September 2009 when another secret site was revealed, which is this Fordow, which is near Qom, which is a second enrichment site which Iran was building. And this had the added dimension of being a site that's under a mountain, a site that was built to be a place where Iran could continue enrichment if Natanz were attacked. And this was a fairly serious development. This was followed in October 2009 by a very hopeful development because Iran and the P5+1, the 6 nations negotiating with Iran, agreed on a fuel swap where Iran would ship out most of its enriched uranium and in return would get fuel for a research reactor in Tehran which makes medical isotopes. I call this the magic compromise because this was a formula that would have restored confidence, that would have set the stage for talks, that would have reassured the West that Iran could not produce a nuclear weapon because they would have shipped out their enriched uranium. So as we have often seen in the Iranian nuclear crisis, there are elements of increased concern, such as the Qom facility being revealed. At the same time, there's a hopeful diplomatic development. The fuel swap deal did not go anywhere. It fell victim to domestic concerns inside Iran. And then in December 2009, the Iranian President Ahmadinejad announced that Iran would be enriching to 20%. That is, that if it couldn't get the fuel for its research reactor, it would begin the process of making the fuel itself. The concern about 20%, which is key to where we are even today, is that when you enrich uranium from its natural state to fuel for a power reactor, that's basically up to 5%. Weapons-grade uranium is over 90%. But since enrichment is an exponential process, that it's not a straight line, enriching to 20% is 80% of the way toward weapon grade. So when Iran was enriching to 20%, this set off alarm bells in Western capitals and in Israel, because Iran was significantly increasing its ability to break out, if it wished, to make a nuclear weapon. Then in February 2010, Iran launched a missile capable of carrying a satellite, because with the concern about Iran having fissile material and getting weapon is a concern about delivering it. And a lot of the concern about Iran comes from the fact that they have a very developed missile program, they have a very developed enrichment program. You put those two together, and it looks like a weapons program. In May 2010, Turkey and Brazil tried to rescue the fuel swap agreement. That did not work. And in June 2010, the most serious UN sanctions were levied in UN Security Council 1929. At this point, we have sanctions stepping up. We have concern that Iran is enriching much closer to weapon grade. And we have concern that Iran is developing a facility where they would be immune to military attack. In short, we have a lot of escalation. In August 2010, the Russians tried to negotiate separately a step-by-step agreement with Iran. It did not work. In September 2010, there was a meeting of the P5+1, which is Britain, China, France, Germany, Russia, and the United States, telling the Russians, please don't cut a separate deal with the Iranians. And the Russians said in answer to that, okay, but you are not pursuing talks, and it's a big mistake. And this led to talks in December 2010 in Geneva, where the great concern going in was, would Iran talk about the nuclear program? And in fact, in Geneva, they talked about the nuclear program, and they talked about just about everything else. And these talks in Geneva set the stage for talks in January 2011 in Istanbul, where the goal was to get down to concrete measures, confidence-building measures. It could be a fuel swap, it could be something else, to begin to de-escalate the crisis. And Iran came to Istanbul in 2010 and basically torpedoed the prospect of any negotiations by saying that if you want to talk, you must lift all sanctions and you must unconditionally recognize our right to enrich. And then at the end of 2011, we have the beginning of unilateral sanctions from the United States and from the European Union, which for the first time begin to target Iran's central bank and begin to target Iran's ability to sell oil, which is the lifeblood of its economy. So this background is important because, in a sense, in the meeting in Istanbul, we had somewhat a repeat of the Geneva December 2010 talks, which were just designed to start the talks again. But, of course, these were much more successful and much more significant because on March 5th in Washington, U.S. President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu met. And it was at this meeting that Obama pretty much said to Netanyahu, look, the loose talk of war has to stop. There still is time for diplomacy, and we must still try diplomacy. And Netanyahu, without ever agreeing overtly to this, obviously accepted this, and we had a new chance for diplomacy. And significantly, the meeting was March 5th. On March 6th, Catherine Ashton, who is the representative of the European Union for foreign policy, sent a letter to the Iranians saying, let's talk. And this is what led to the talks in Istanbul in April. At the same time, we started to see comments from Iran that were more hopeful that we had seen in years. The Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, said, we heard 2 days ago, this is after the talks in Washington, we heard 2 days ago that the U.S. president said that they are not thinking about war with Iran. These words are good words and an exit from delusion. And then you had Rafsanjani, who was had become a figure for the opposition. He was renamed as head of the Expediency Council in March, a very key body in Iran. And then he gave an interview in which he said that he had told Ayatollah Khamenei that that not talking with the United States and not having relations was untenable. Why should we not negotiate with the United States? Negotiations does not mean surrender. We will negotiate. If they accept our position, or if we accept their position, the issue is over. The fact that he gave such an extended interview after being on the outs for so long, the fact that Khamenei had greeted in an unprecedentedly positive way comments by U.S. president, was a sign that there was a new mood in Iran, or certainly a new openness, or certainly signs that we had that were hopeful. And this hopefulness continued into the meeting in Istanbul. And the meeting in Istanbul on April 14th was very much the sort of meeting that had taken place in Geneva 16 months before, which was not to reach an agreement, but just to start talking. And above all, to see, on the Western side, to see if the Iranians would be willing to talk. And also, I know that speaking to officials from the United States, there certainly was an effort to have a meeting that would begin to correspond to Iranian concerns, Iranian cultural and concerns of pride. For instance, Catherine Ashton had dinner with Saeed Jalili, the Iranian representative, on Friday night. And at this dinner, which lasted 3 hours, they did not talk about the nuclear issue. They talked about other issues of concern, the Arab Spring, all sorts of things. But it was the deliberate effort to have a get-acquainted meeting, to have a meeting where they could just begin to talk to each other, because these are two sides where there's a tremendous lack of communication. And then when the talks started on the Saturday after that Friday meeting, issues were discussed. Jalili brought up 20%. The other side brought up their concerns about 20% enrichment. But as they brought up these things, two things happened. One thing that happened is that there was no cutoff of the discussion. There was not a point where Jalili said, as it happened in the previous meetings, it's fine to talk about this, but what about U.S. military presence in the Gulf? What about capitalism, which is destroying the world? They never wandered into that sort of discussion. But they never also went further and said, we must resolve the issue now. These were discussed, touched on, and dealt with in a very businesslike way. Also, the Iranians made very clear that they expected there to be relief from sanctions, because realize going to this meeting, you have an unprecedented level of sanctions on both the financial level and on the level of Iran's ability to do business worldwide. And Iran came to this meeting saying very clearly that the sanctions must be lifted. We want relief from sanctions. So all these issues were discussed over in a 10-hour meeting that was very businesslike. And this was exactly what the West had been looking for. The Iranians said, following on what the Supreme Leader had said, they said that the West has abandoned its language of threats, so we're content. And there were a lot of face-saving elements to the meeting. One was, and this was part of what had led up to the meeting, one was the Iranian concern that talk of war has to stop. Second, and Jalili was surprisingly frank about this in his comments after the meeting, that he must have something that he can sell to the Iranian people. And one element of this was in the final statement by Catherine Ashton. She said Iran has a right to a peaceful nuclear program under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has consistently, from the beginning of this crisis, wanted its right to enrich to be affirmed unconditionally. And enrichment is part of a peaceful nuclear program. So Ashton made this clear, but she also made clear that Iran has to live up to its obligations under the NPT, which is not to seek nuclear weapons, not to seek to acquire nuclear weapons technology from other countries, and not to export it. So both sides restated positions that were not new, but it was presented in a package that that Jalili could take back to Iran and say to the Iranian people, we actually won in Istanbul. And this is precisely what's happened. In the Iranian press, you see statements that our right to enrich has been acknowledged, which it quite not exactly has, but certainly no one disputes Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy. And as of the second Bush administration, the United States has been presenting itself as a champion of a peaceful civilian Iranian nuclear program. The other way in which this became a very saving gesture is that Secretary Clinton, the Secretary of State, said in a talk, I think it was April 1st, where she said that the Iranians say that they have a fatwa, a religious decree, that they would never have weapons of mass destruction. And she said, this is wonderful. Let's operationalize it. Let's turn it into something that will be codified and that we can work with. And the Iranian reaction was not, oh, how could they talk about our fatwa? They don't understand. The Iranian reaction was, it is great that she accepts our fatwa. So now you have a position where Iran can claim that their fatwa is being used as a framework, as material for an eventual settlement, where the President of the United States has said, we must not have war, let's have diplomacy, and where their rights under the NPT have been acknowledged. Also, significantly, the talks were held in Istanbul. This is where Iran wanted the talks to be. There was a last-minute dispute about Istanbul because Iran was upset about Turkey, and Turkey, its support of Syria and its cutting down on oil sales. But the bottom line is that the talks took place in Istanbul, and the next talks will be in Baghdad. So Iran is getting its way on that. And also after the talks, Ali Akbar Veliati, the Supreme Leader's foreign policy advisor, said, quote, they reached the conclusion that Iran does not recognize the language of threats. In these negotiations, the Westerners for the first time recognized Iran's right to achieve peaceful nuclear energy within the NPT framework. The Islamic Republic of Iran did not say anything but this from the very beginning. And the foreign minister of Iran, Ali Akbar Salehi, said today, in a report today, that he feels that it is a hopeful approach to the talks. It is the beginning of the end of quote, the manufactured Iranian file. So this is all hopeful. And as far as the face-saving gestures go, a senior U.S. official told me that it doesn't cost the United States anything. And what the official said is, I don't care how we get there, I just want to get there, which is some sort of agreement. So you have, for the first time in a long time in Istanbul, it's not the first time there have been these kinds of discussions, because in 2004 there was an agreement on Iran suspending its uranium enrichment, and there were talks in Geneva in 2005 where there was good dialogue. But since then, there hasn't, and certainly there has not been good dialogue that has involved the United States. So this is unprecedented, and it's very hopeful. Now, looking forward to that, we have to sound a warning note that even though the atmosphere has changed and the elements of a deal are clear, a deal is not done, and there are three major problems I see. The first is that you see in the rhetoric going into the meeting in Baghdad. So we had the meeting in Istanbul, which was getting the process started, the Iranians showing they're serious about talking. But there's no agreement. And in Baghdad, which is May 23rd, there will be great pressure for there to be some kind of concrete measures. And Iran has said they want to see sanctions lifted as a confidence-building measure. And the United States says that it wants to see confidence-building measures carried out by Iran, and these would have to be verified before sanctions could be lifted. This is a potential deal breaker, because if Iran comes to Baghdad and says, okay, we are willing, these are three things the West wants the most. We are willing to stop enriching uranium to 20%. We're willing to ship out the uranium, which we have enriched to 20%, and we will stop work at Fordow, which is the second site at this reinforced place under a mountain. But in return, we want the sanctions lifted immediately. One, it's impossible because the financial sanctions, some of them are mandated by the U.S. Congress. It's not hard, it's not easy to unravel them. And on the other hand, the United States has made clear that there will be no sanctions relief until, one, the 20% enrichment stops, and it can be verified that it stopped. Two, if it's agreed to ship the uranium out, it has to be shipped out. That doesn't happen overnight. And three, if work is stopped at Fordow, and if that is a condition that's absolute, there are already 4 centrifuge cascades turning in Fordow. They've laid the piping for over 2,000 centrifuges. There would have to be a lot of stepping down in Fordow and verification of it by the UN Nuclear Watchdog in order for sanctions to be lifted. The second problem is timing, is that these talks cannot drag on. We already have a comment from Israel that Iran is getting a freebie and it's getting 6 more weeks to enrich uranium unhindered. Whether that's a fair comment or not, we can get into. But you certainly have pressure from the eventual Republican nominee, who will be in the U.S. election, who will be holding Obama's feet to the fire on this. And you certainly have pressure from the U.S. Congress saying, we've got the strongest sanctions ever. We've got them so concerned about this that they are willing to come back to talks in a serious way. We cannot lift those sanctions. And we cannot get into a process where they promise to do something, and then we hold on sanctions, and it goes on for months. So timing will be definitely a problem. But in a weird way, it can also be a help, because if the process is to unfold, it's going to have to be on a fairly tight timetable. And I think that if people hold to that, that's what gives a chance for success. And the third problem is reversibility. If the Iranians, for instance, stop enriching to 20%, it would not be that difficult to restart it. But if the West, if the United States and the European Union start unraveling these financial sanctions, they're much more difficult to reinstate. So these are the problems. But the bottom line is that we're in a situation where no one wants a military conflict. Israel doesn't want to attack Iran. The United States doesn't want to attack Iran. And Iran, I think, is very conscious of both the measures that are being taken against it on the covert level and about the real possibility of a military attack. So, and also Iran's economy is really feeling the effects from the sanctions. The sanctions are already cutting into their oil sales. There are reports that Iran has half of its shipping fleet storing oil at this point. And of course, the oil sanctions have not even taken effect. They take place, the European embargo on selling oil, on buying oil from Iran, goes into effect June 28th, and the U.S. embargo saying that people who do that will be unable to do business with the United States goes into effect on July 1st. So the sanctions have not taken effect, and they're already having an effect. And at the same time, since there is this time until July where they do take effect, that certainly gives time for talks to possibly postpone those, and that could be a relatively painless way of putting off sanctions. So there certainly is a will to, or a narrative why people would want to settle this. There is a narrative you could make from Iran, which is that on March 2nd there were parliamentary elections, and the supreme leader solidified his power against Ahmadinejad. It's been a long-standing power struggle between the two. I think you could say at this point that Ahmadinejad is a lame duck. So, and this is, I've got this from Bernard, I'll channel Bernard for this, is that Iran is a country that operates by consensus. And when you have domestic political disputes, the sort of disputes that may have been the reason why the October 2000 agreement didn't go forward, and if you have more of a political consensus within Iran now after the parliamentary elections, perhaps you have the supreme leader in a position where he can make a deal with the West, where he can strike the nuclear deal. So you have the hopeful signs, you have the cautionary signs, and you have an unprecedented atmosphere for talks. One other thing, and I guess I should wrap it up at this point, is even on the U.S. side, the United States says that they absolutely want there to be full compliance. That is, that Iran honors UN Security Council resolutions, which call on it to suspend uranium enrichment, to cooperate with the IAEA in its investigation, and to apply the additional protocol, which allows for wider inspections. This is a hardline position which, on a long-term basis, would be impossible, I think, for Iran to accept. Then you have an article by a former senior official in the administration, Dennis Ross, on April 5th, in which he spoke about the possibility of Iran keeping some uranium enrichment. He spoke about Iran keeping 1,000 centrifuges turning. Now, when I spoke to Dennis about this, he stresses that he's not in the administration. This is not an administration position, and this is just his personal opinion. At the same time, the fact that someone so senior coming out so soon from the administration to be floating the idea of Iranian keeping uranium enrichment makes one think that down the road there could be a compromise where Iran gets to keep some low ability to enrich uranium, not at the 20% level, but at the low enriched level. There might be a proviso where it has to ship a significant part of the uranium out of the country to be made to fuel, perhaps. And there would have to be really expanded inspections in Iran to make sure that not only is it not enriching uranium over what it should be, but where it's producing centrifuges, where there are other sites that could be possible nuclear sites. And Iran has said in the past that they would agree to this kind of very heavy inspection regime. So just to sum up, as in the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, it seems to be a solution that everybody agrees is a solution that would be the eventual solution. There seems to be a renewed willingness to talk, and we have these very significant talks coming up in Baghdad in May. At the same time, a settlement is still a long shot, but given the kind of risk involved, namely of war or of even stronger sanctions, which could cause Iran even more economic problem at a time when they desperately need investment in the oil fields. Their oil production is dropping. I think we have a hopeful constellation of conditions that could lead to a settlement that we're not there before this March 5th meeting, and we'll see what happens in Baghdad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll now open the floor to your question. Bernard, can you just wait for the microphone, please? Yes, sure. Oh, Mr. Bernard Urquhart. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, for you have taken my last question about internal issues. One of the main problems you focus on that is the difference of timing of clock. The difference of timing between international community and Iran, and the fact that domestic issues are very important on both sides. And we have torpedoed some agreements previously, and Iranians have done the same. The most important thing I think today is to see why Khamenei is accepting discussion today. In my opinion, the first fact is that there is success for Iran on the nuclear issue. Today, Iran is able to enrich uranium and to have a bomb one day or the other, even if the regime is changing tomorrow morning. So there is a national consensus on the nuclear issue. Iran today, the state of Iran, is controlling technically the nuclear issue. And for the regime, it's important. There is a national consensus on that. But the main question is to control this process. And until now, there was an opposition between the guide and the President of the Republic, Khatami, in the 19th and beginning of 21st century, and then with Ahmadinejad. And this opposition between the guide and the president made no agreement possible inside Iran. Because all agree on opening, of course, because they need opening, because Iran is declining economically. But if the opposition is taking profit for that, it's not possible. So they torpedo systematically all the negotiation. But today, one date was important. It's not the 5th of March. It was the 3rd of March, the elections in Iran. And these local elections, the parliamentary elections, are very important because there was nothing to say about this election. It was not a victory of Khamenei exactly. Ahmadinejad has got some people inside the new parliament. And so, but there is political consensus inside Iran. And all the political forces agree on the fact that something has to be done today because of the success they had in nuclear issue. And the other point, of course, the sanction for international for the international community. So today, the Islamic control is possible. And so and there is a consensus on that inside Iran. So Iran now is ready to compromise on the third point, the international community. They need, of course, the sanctions to be lifted to make Iran back again in the 21st century. But the main question you ask is how to do so, since there is a lot of problems. And we have to think about a roadmap about Iran. 33 years of embargo, sanction, and access of evil on both sides is not easy to be cleaned up. So we need now, perhaps in our think tanks, to see, to try to draw the lines of a future roadmap in which way, avoiding Iran to be contempted, avoiding the Islamic power to be too much diminished by the international relation. We have to be very cautious to make this agreement sustainable. So our job now is to try to not to destroy this first hope we have found in Istanbul.
I agree with you. And one thing that's significant in both Istanbul, and it will be the case in Baghdad, is that there have been reports that the United States would come to the Istanbul meeting saying you must stop enriching to 20%, you must ship out your uranium, and you must close Fordo, but they did nothing of the kind. It was very much in a listening mode. And I know from talking to the diplomats involved, almost all of them, that there is an effort to do things in a way that will be Iran-friendly, that will be something the Iranians can live with. And even in Baghdad, I don't think that the United States and its allies will be coming in with demands. It will mainly be listening to what Iran is going to propose. So Iran is getting the chance to shape the process very much, and that's very intentional on the part of the P5+1. Hopefully to start to develop a roadmap, first for the nuclear issue, and then as you do that, you could go into wider issues. And I think this is a fruit of a lot of past bad experiences, and the effort is to listen to Iran and to have them be a partner in shaping what's going forward.
If I may add something to what you said. First of all, you didn't mention Erdogan's mission to Iran, which was very important. You know, he met with President Obama in South Korea and went to Iran with a clear message for the supreme leader. That was number one, very important, you know, which made then the supreme leader, from what I hear, allow this negotiation to start. I mean, his attitude was, if you believe that something is waiting for us at the end of the day, go ahead and do the negotiation. Number two, I don't think, even if they reach an agreement, we will ever see a resumption of relation between the United States, political relation, and Iran, as long as Ayatollah Khamenei is around. Maybe after he dies, there would be a resumption of relation. The two things are completely separated from each other. Political relation and coming to an understanding and agreement on the nuclear issue. And Ahmadinejad hardly plays a role in these days in being part of the consensus or not being part of the consensus. I think he tried to steal the limelight by just making this disastrous trip to Abu Musa, creating a lot of problem for the regime, exactly when they didn't want any problem, international problem. There was a question here. Yes. And then Aaron, and then sure.
Michael, thank you so much for your presentation. But being there during these talks, I like to get your view about the position of the P5+1, especially the French. As you know, before the talks, there was a talk that there was rumors that the French had maintained the hardest position vis-a-vis the talks in Iran, and but all the reports coming out after the meeting was that there was a apparent unity among all the P5+1, and we already know, of course, the Russian and the Chinese position. But I want to know if you descended or picked up any any side talks of how the French reacted to the whole talks, and whether down the road going to Baghdad they would have different perspective to that.
Well, I can tell you that the French were delighted, really enthusiastic about the talks, and I spoke to the French representative after the talks, and they were just very happy about it. They felt that it was that the Iranians had spoken seriously, that a door was open towards beginning to discuss these issues. So the French were quite happy about it. Actually, the Americans, I thought, were the most kind of bittersweet about coming out of the talks, because in terms of Turkey, one thing that happened at the talks to some extent is that the Turks seem to be much less have lost a little bit of their clout from the first Istanbul meeting, because the Iranians were very upset with them about cutting back on oil sales, and Erdogan, after that meeting, when he came back, he was quite negative in his comments about the Iranians. So the Turks seem to have lost a bit of their luster were at this meeting, because there was much less tension between Turkey and Iran in the run-up to and after the meeting. I think the American feeling is that you're still hearing a language from the Iranians which could end up leading to the talks not working out. Jalil was very insistent about sanctions relief. He did not really give much encouragement about 20%, but there are going to be experts meetings leading up to the Baghdad meeting, and this is the first time in a long time that in the lead up to a meeting, there will be able to be substantive discussions between the two sides to work out their positions ahead of the meeting. In other words, the issues have been opened in Istanbul, and now we have 4 weeks left in the run-up to the meeting in Baghdad. The two sides haven't started meeting yet. I spoke to Brussels this morning, but they'll start meeting soon. And this will be really crucial, the kind of terms the Sherpas can work out heading into the meeting. So the bottom line, the French seemed much more happy than the Americans at the end of the meeting. And the Russians were happy, and they also were reinstated to some extent at this meeting as the kind of intermediary for Iran, because Ryabkov, the Russian representative, had 2 meetings with Jalili. The Americans had none. That, once again, was a face-saving gesture, because the Iranians could go back to Tehran and say, we didn't meet with the Americans. See, they wanted to meet with us, and we didn't. So there are all sorts of ways in which pride can be saved, in which there can be face-saving. But the bottom line is there are going to have to be, within a fairly realistic time frame, concessions from Iran on its nuclear progress, and concessions from the West on the sanctions they're imposing. And the devil's in the details. There's a lot to be worked out. Let's see what happens in Baghdad.
Aaron?
Michael, maybe you can help me understand something. You have 9 countries in the world that have deliverable nuclear weapons, only one of which we have judged to be irresponsible. So the issue of the possession of nuclear weapons has a lot to do with the character of the regime's ambitions,
North Korea,
and how it's perceived. 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and then 4 others: the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Israelis, and the North Koreans. I'm assuming that, or let's say 7 we judge to be quote-unquote responsible, okay? So it's not the details that concern me. You could have a process, a serious process. My question is, how do you get to where you want to go without, and it gets to Hala's question, without a fundamental change in the acquisitive character of the regime. In other words, you're not just talking about the acquisition, it's not just the technical issue, it's a broader set of issues which gets to the very character of the regime and the regime's relationship with the West and the West's perception of the regime. And what I don't understand is how to sustain this process, because that's what you have to do, beyond a technical fix. So here's the question. Is there a tiny deal as opposed to a bigger deal that could reasonably be achieved, that could actually serve as a point of departure to weather the storm of what is going to happen once the tiny deal is reached on all of the other broader issues? Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian fear that we want to change the regime, which we do, the Israeli factor, which is going to be out there. The Israelis are going to be very unhappy, presumably. The Republican issue, the election campaign. How do you even begin to get at these broader questions?
Great question.
Short answer.
Okay, basically,
No, we have many.
okay, basically what you're seeing is an effort for what you call a tiny deal. That's precisely what's going on. And the P5+1 was created to deal with the nuclear issue. They have refused to go beyond the nuclear issue. And what you say is, I'll keep it short, what you say is true, all these problems, but the tactic of the P5+1 and of the United States has been to try to deal with this nuclear issue as a obviously first step to getting towards the larger issues. But the nuclear issue is so incendiary, is so transformative, that the idea is you've got to deal with this first. And Iran has been resisting dealing with it as a tiny issue. They want to deal with it as a larger issue. But now Iran is signing on in this process to dealing with it. But those problems remain. The concerns remain from Israel, obviously. And Israel does not think this is going to work out, by the way.
No, after this.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan Gieswetter. A couple of questions, Michael. One is, what did you learn in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem? Because that's obviously quite important to this. And secondly, what about the modalities of negotiation in this month that we have now? Are they happening in Vienna? How do you see this coming about?
The first thing I learned in Tel Aviv is that you must have the taxi driver turn the meter on, and you don't accept the deal he offers you of the 20 shekels for a 14-shekel ride. That's the first thing I learned in Tel Aviv. What I learned in Israel is that the Israelis do not think it's going to work. They get even further than Hale. They don't think the Iranians will make a deal on the nuclear issue, let alone on the larger issues. They also point out that Iran has managed to transform a stick into a carrot. In other words, originally they were in complete violation by enriching to 20%. It was against UN Security Council resolutions. It was against what everybody wanted. And now they're offering up something they did that was a violation as a concession. So Israel is concerned that Iran continues to transform the nature of the process in order to both create facts on the ground and to delay. And they're very concerned that the P5+1 will once again be a dupe of that sort of thing. So Israel, on every level, thinks it's not going to work and think Iran is managing to do what they did in the past, which is to increase its nuclear program, defuse serious measures against it, such as the sanctions, and to postpone any kind of settlement. How it's going on, there are representatives from the EU, a representative from the EU and a representative from Iran who will be negotiating. And they will be the Sherpas negotiating on what will be discussed in Baghdad. And once again, from the United States side, they're waiting to see what the Iranians will propose.
Well, actually, you asked most of my questions, so let me ask you a follow-up questions about these technical meetings. So can you tell us more about what these technical meetings will focus on?
They will focus on the issues that will come up in Baghdad. So obviously they'll be focusing on the 20%. They'll be focusing also on Iran allowing wider inspections under the additional protocol. They'll be functioning on Iran giving earlier notice of when it builds nuclear facilities. They'll be functioning all the issues that have been around, and I guess selecting which ones will be discussed in Baghdad. So you have the issue of 20%. I think it's possible that what could come out of Baghdad is that Iran will put off the 20% issue and will agree to wider inspections under the additional protocol, something called 3.1 subsidiary agreement, which is that you give early notification when you get build nuclear facilities, and then the P5+1 and Iran will try to sell that as progress, and that could get a lot of flack from the Republicans and the Congress here in the States.
Yes, in the back.
Michael, thank you. Greg Tillman. You had mentioned the possibility of postponing sanctions implementation. It looks like now that by the middle of the summer, not only would Europe fully implement the sanctions it is as announced, but the U.S. Congress is considering additional sanctions. So I wonder really about how the Iranians regard the postponement of additional sanctions. I mean, how much leverage would we get for that? The Iranians obviously want sanctions relief. They don't just want, don't sanction us more. So my question is that something that gives us some maneuvering room for us to say, well, we won't make it worse for a while pending negotiating outcome?
I think so. And I think even getting to that will be difficult because you would have to have concrete measures such as shipping 20% out of the country. It would have to be verified. So the meeting's May 23rd. The European sanctions come into effect June 28th. Time is short, so there would have to be something happening quickly. But if it does, that'd be good. Any kind of rapid result would show that maybe this is going to work out. And it's fairly easy for the Europeans and for the United States to say, look, we were going to move towards these sanctions on July 1st and June 28th. The president has waiver rights, but since there's concrete progress, we will put off that decision until September 1st. So I think it's very likely that if there is to be a successful process, that would be a way in which it would happen.
And I think the regime would be able to sell it
Absolutely.
to the people as a victory. What is interesting is that on Friday, all the Friday prayers across the country, which get their talking points from the central government and the Tehran Friday prayer office, stuck to the same theme, that Istanbul was a victory for Iran. And the press has not so far criticized at all, even the more conservative press, what happened in Istanbul. So I think if the administration decides to postpone, they would be able to sell it to the population as a first step towards lifting the sanctions eventually. Yes, please. I saw it. Yeah. Yes.
When Foreign Minister Milton Honig, when Foreign Minister Salehi refers to dropping the manufactured case against Iran in his statement, I guess yesterday or today, is he referring to a continued refusal to answer the IAEA's questions on the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program?
Sure, I'm sure he is. The Iranian position is that Iran has complied with its safeguards. It allows inspections of all its nuclear facilities. Iran feels it's in compliance with the IAEA, and they feel that the file against it is a political one. So they reject the continuing IAEA investigation. They feel the current issue, which is possible military dimensions of Iranian nuclear work, is based on forged documents. They feel that both the IAEA investigation against it and UN Security Council resolutions are manufactured, illegitimate, and politically motivated. He undoubtedly means all of that.
Rob?
Thanks, Michael, for excellent briefing. In the negotiations, has the issue of a security assurance come up at all from the Iranians that if they come into compliance with NPT obligations, a commitment, an assurance of kind of non-intervention on military action would not be taken against them, and In that context, the statements that the Supreme Leader made about Libya have we sort of, as the West, essentially priced itself out of the security assurance market through that intervention?
It didn't come up that much in Istanbul, despite a report in Haaretz that said it did. It didn't. That's a very important issue. And in the Russian plan, which will be, in some sense, a framework of a step-by-step phased agreement, part of the Russian plan is that Iran would get security assurances. The United States has resisted giving security assurances through the whole process of the Iranian nuclear crisis. In 2004, when the first talking points were enunciated for how one would deal with Iran, when the Europeans drew up what was called a non-paper, they had a big section called security assurances. And when the Americans got their hands on the non-paper, they crossed out that section. And from then on, security assurances have not been on the table. The Russians want it to be on the table, and one has to assume that if this process goes further, at the end, that would be something that would be dealt with.
Karen?
Thank you. Carol Murphy. I'm wondering, there's been some discussion about the credibility of the fatwa of Khamenei against acquiring nuclear weapons. Could you give us your opinion of the credibility? Is there a fatwa? What does it exactly address?
This was something that came up in Israel a lot. They pointed out that, and perhaps Hale can comment on this, that they feel that a fatwa is not binding, that it's something that can be changed for expediency, that if Iran felt that for security reasons it had to change the fatwa, or if there is this, the Israelis even were saying, there's this tactic in Iran of telling your adversary what he wants to hear, and you have a right to lie to your adversary in order to get around a difficult situation. So, at least in Israel, there's no belief that the fatwa carries any weight. And I've certainly looked to find a written copy of it. I've never found an actual copy of the fatwa, but apparently that's not that significant. And the Iranians refer to it. Bottom line, the Iranians say it's a religious doctrine, that they would not seek weapons of mass destruction against their religion. There is cynicism about it in this town, and there's outright disbelief about it in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem.
Karen, to this day, nobody has seen that fatwa. I mean, because usually if there is a fatwa, they put it either on the website of Ayatollah Khamenei, or they circulate it, or there is, to this day, there is nobody has seen that fatwa.
And we've looked. Well, if you think about it, you have your adversary say to you, I'm against weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
So it is a great response to say, that's really fantastic. We agree with you. Now let's get that. Let's take that idea and turn it into something operational. So, and it also had the added effect, which I don't know if she thought would happen, that the Iranians seized upon it, saying they are negotiating now on our terms. They are taking our fatwa seriously. That is the basis of negotiations. So it was an incredible move on her part to take their discourse and use it for our ends. And secondly, it turned out to be a face-saving gesture. So it's a win-win if everybody goes by the fatwa.
David, you have the last question.
It's a follow-on. Over the weekend, there was an article in the Post by my colleague Joby Ward, where he pointed out in the 80s, Ayatollah Khamenei argued exactly the opposite, that they needed the nuclear weapons for A, B, and C reason. So my question is, what are we to make out of what he was saying in the 80s as opposed to what he's saying in the 2000s?
Well, David, when he came into power, at first, the Ayatollah cut down on all the nuclear program. He was against it. Then in the 80s, when they were at war with Iraq, at some point there was a study made where they determined that without weapons of mass destruction, they might not be able to win the war. And it was at that point, I think, that the whole idea of a nuclear program was revived. And then the Iranians started dealing with the black market, the Pakistani black market, in 1987. and for other reasons, it had a life of its own beyond the ending of the Iran-Iraq War.
It had something to do, David, with the chemical attacks on Iran, the use of chemical attacks on Iran. Bill, last word. We're going he take the mic. Yes.
Just a clarification: the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa after a request from the military, his own military, to use poison gas in retaliation, and the fatwa said no weapons of mass destruction. It said essentially the same thing that is said now. The nuclear program issue was over the question of whether a program that had been approved by the Shah was still valid. And after discussion, they decided, and Khomeini decided, that the peaceful uses was beneficial to Iran and should continue. There's no record at this time of a nuclear military weaponization program. It occurred later.
Thank you. Please join me. You want to comment on this?
No.
Okay. Join me in thanking Michael, and we'll meet again after Baghdad. Same time, same day.
Thank you very much.